Got it. Thank you, Nicole. The first module in couple modules in this training series were the leasing versus rental assistance module in Bridge, and then the module in Bridge that's focused on the topic for today's training, which is participant rent contributions. Participant rent and calculating how much rent the folks in your projects should be paying is one of the longer, more detailed requirements of this funding stream. So we wanted to have a practice session so that you can all have some hands-on practice implementing the stuff that was was covered in the participant rent contributions module. So I want to do a quick check-in just based on that before we do actual introductions. I see that at least one person in the chat has some issue with accessing some of the content in Bridge, but I want to check with you all. Has everybody completed the participant rent contributions module in Bridge, that e-learning module with the slides and the quiz questions? Maybe a thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no. Excellent. Great, great, great. Okay. That's what we'll be practicing today. Okay. Thanks for letting us know. Then the rest of the e-learning modules are going to cover other requirements, leasing, total unit rent. So the standards around how much can the total rent on the unit be, and housing quality standards. During the training, we're going to be doing stuff together. We're going to be doing practice activities. We're actually going to be calculating a hypothetical client's portion of rent. And I'm going to be relying on you all to engage in whatever way works for you. If it works best for you to just be working along on your own document and no questions come up, that's okay. But it'll be really helpful if you do have questions, if you can put them in the chat, or just come off mute and raise them. And I may ask for you all to engage more actively, just so I know that y'all are still with us, still following, and still literally at your desks, right? Because without cameras, it's hard for me to tell. So I encourage you to be as engaged in the chat or off mute as you need to be. Closed captioning should also be available, and you should be able to get that by, let me see. There should be a button on your control panel that says live transcript, and that should turn on closed captioning for you. Okay, so we're going to do some quick introductions. There's not many of us in the room, so it's good to let's get to know each other a little bit. So just go ahead and put in the chat your name. If you're with an organization, what's your organization? And let us know why you're here today. So for example, you work at a COC, you work with a COC funded permanent supportive housing project, right? That would be a reason that you would need to do this. You work in a COC funded project and you do client rent calculations. Or maybe you don't work at a currently COC funded project, but you're interested in learning the rules because your organization is interested in COC funding. So go ahead and let us know in the chat your name, where you're from, and why are you here today? Great. Okay. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Peter. Okay, great. See, Santa Clara TBRA, housing specialist with the SOAR program, HHIP, learning more about the COC and housing, a couple folks from our Bill Wilson Center grantee. Okay, great. Then because I'm seeing a lot of folks who are here who aren't necessarily working with a COC funded project, but are interested in learning more, I do want to, that's awesome. We're so happy to have you here. I do want to make sure it's really clear that the rules and the process we're going to go over don't apply generally to all housing programs in Santa Clara County. They just apply to those programs that use the specific continuum of care program federal funding, right? So I don't necessarily want to tell you like you can take this back and use it, but we're going to go over the what you would do if you were in a COC funded program or working in a COC funded program. Are there any questions before we begin? Anything come up for you about the online training? Any burning questions from that you're hoping to get answered? Any questions about what we're going to do today? Okay. Well, as questions come up, please ask them. So today is all about practice, right? You've gone through the rules, you've done the module on the rules, you've answered some quiz questions. We are going to go through a practice hypothetical. I'm going to share with you all a fake client situation, and then together we're going to calculate that fake participant's rent. And then we will have some time left for Q&A to try to figure out what anything that comes up that's unclear, anything that you've seen in your work that's unclear. Sorry, 1 second. I'm having some technical difficulties with my Word document. Okay. Okay. All right, Nicole, can you tell me if that's showing the rent calculation activity worksheet and if you can see it and read it?
Yes, I'm seeing you operate a sponsor-based permanent supportive housing project.
That's it. Perfect. Okay. So this hypothetical participant is this first, this first hypothetical here, the Adams household. We're pretending that we are in a permanent supportive housing project that is COC funded. And we've chosen permanent supportive housing specifically because the rules around calculating participant rent for rapid rehousing projects can be a little different. Rapid rehousing has a feature where the amount a client is paying in rent can change over time. Typically, we expect the client rent contribution to go up. And so that's not necessarily needing to be tied to this rent calculation. Sometimes it is. So we're going to keep this simple and we're going to focus on a permanent supportive housing project where if you're doing rental assistance in a permanent supportive housing project, this is always what you need to do to calculate how much rent the client is going to be paying versus how much rent is going to be covered by the project. So in our this hypothetical, the Adams household is the tenant, and there is one member of this household. It's Anthony Adams. He's an adult, 30 years old. He has a diagnosis of HIV/AIDS, and his annual income is $20,000. That's employment income. He has an estimated $8,000 of medical expenses annually, and about $6,000 of those are actually covered through his employment. So that's the hypothetical that we're going to be working on. Just by looking at this, can anybody pick out an aspect of Anthony's situation that you think is going to be, like, what's going to be relevant to our rent calculation? What do we need to keep in mind? What are the pieces of information here that we can pull out and say, okay, these are the things that are probably going to be relevant to the rent calculation?
First, it's going to be his income and then how much he has left from whatever he gets reimbursed.
Yep. Yeah. Big one, $20,000, that's his income. It's really important. And then we know his medical expenses and the fact that they're getting reimbursed, that's going to come into play. Is there any other information that might be relevant when we're calculating his rent contribution? Yep. Yep. He has an HIV/AIDS diagnosis, which means that, you know, his disability may come into play for sure. Okay. I'm going to put into the chat a document that you all can use to follow along if you choose. I'm also going to be screen sharing this document. So if you would prefer to follow along on the screen, that's totally okay. Gotta find it. There we go. Okay. So in the chat, there's a Word document, and if you'd like to download it and follow along and actually type in the answers, that's totally something that you can do. There we go. This is that worksheet. There we go. So we're just going to be walking through the steps of the rent calculation. And I apologize that rent calculations aren't more entertaining and exciting, but they are what they are. So we're going to follow the process. This is a sort of sample form. The forms that our COC funded projects in the community use might look different. Often this is done in an Excel form. I know that some organizations in the community have more or less complicated forms that automate some of the calculations for you all. We're just going to use this simple example one because it's a pretty simple hypothetical. Okay. So our first step, can anybody remind us of what the first step is? Does anybody remember what the first step is in calculating participants' rent? Step number one. There's a clue in the form. What's our first step in the form? I can give you this one because maybe some folks are not chiming in because it just feels like an obvious question. The first step is to figure out the household annual income, right? This isn't that hard for this hypothetical, but what we need to do is make sure we know who the household members are, right? So in this case, it's just Anthony. And then we need to have an estimate of Anthony's anticipated income. We know that the annual income is $20,000, but we also need to figure out how much of that income should be included and how much should be excluded from the calculation, right? Included and excluded income is a determination that is, I mean, there's a lot of different types of income. And so there are a few resources that we have and can provide that help you figure out what types of income are included and what type are excluded. But what we know is that Anthony has $20,000 in employment income. Just real quick, it's obvious answer, but is that included in this calculation or excluded? Employment income. Is that wages and salaries? Yep, thank you. So we're just going to put 20,000 in included income there. Okay. Next step, we need to determine whether Anthony should have a dependent allowance of any kind. Does Anthony have any dependents? No dependents. That's right. So we don't need to worry about that. Childcare allowance, that's the next step. There's no children in the household, there are no dependents, therefore there are no children. So the childcare allowance is not going to play into this. Okay. What about the disability assistance allowance is what we're going to say, because HUD's language is not great, but the disability assistance allowance. What parts of this do we think apply? Okay, so we know we need to factor in reimbursement. Do we know what Anthony is spending that or what the medical assistance costs are that he's using that $8,000 on? Okay. Those of you who have the worksheet, you can scroll back up to the top. What do we know about this $8,000? Do we know what Anthony is spending it on? Yeah, so based on the hypothetical, the information we have, we don't actually know what that's being spent on, but we know it's medical expenses, it's healthcare expenses, right? So in real life, you'd absolutely want to know exactly what, or generally what those expected expenses are. For this disability allowance, the rule is that you deduct reasonable and unreimbursed expenses, but specifically expenses for attendant care or some sort of auxiliary apparatus that allows someone to, that allows a disabled household member or someone else to work. So for example, an oxygen tank that allows someone to be home independently while their spouse or child or other household member goes out to work. That would be an auxiliary apparatus for a disability that allows the household to be employed. So it's very specifically, this disability allowance is related to expenses for attendant care related to a disability or that type of equipment to support someone with a disability. So we're actually going to skip this disability allowance here. But just note that if you were talking with Anthony and Anthony was a real person and you just got the information, oh, I spend about $8,000 on healthcare or medical expenses, you might want to ask specifically, is any of that, in-home care? Okay, but the next one, this is a separate allowance for medical expenses. So to calculate the medical expenses allowance, you look at unreimbursed expenses for the head of household or the head of household spouse if they are over 62 years of age or if they have a disability. Okay. So I've heard people call out the unreimbursed expenses. Yeah, exactly. That in the chat. So you'd want to put in the $8,000 of total medical expenses and the $6,000 of reimbursement, and then you'd get the net total. Yeah. Okay, next allowance here is the elderly/disabled household allowance. So for this is where just the fact that Anthony has a disability come in. I'm going to ask a pretty specific question. There's no reason you should remember this off the top of your head if you're not looking at resources. Does anybody happen to know or to remember what the, oh, it's on the thing. Okay, so what is the amount of elderly or disabled person's allowance that Anthony should get? Yeah, exactly. Just one person, $400. Okay. We're almost there. We're almost done. So we are now able, that is all of the adjustments, pretty simple. And we're going to go to the total adjusted income, which goes here. And our total income adjustments come to 2,400. Okay. We have these two options here, 30% of, and this is where we, so this is the income. We've gotten to the final income amount, which is $17,600. And we need to figure out, is 30% of the monthly adjusted income or 10% of the monthly income going to be bigger, right? Which is the one we're going to be using. Do we have monthly income yet? Yeah. Yep. If we divide annual by 12, yes. All right. So let's do that. What is the monthly? Yeah. So Hannah, is that the monthly adjusted income? Yeah. Great. Cool. What about 10% of total monthly income? Oops. Oops, sorry. So we don't have to walk through this, but you definitely should walk through this if you are actually calculating the rent, but it would be 10% of that monthly total income, right? You always want to do this. I think the point of walking through this particular step is that we can usually assume that it's going to be 30% of the adjusted income that is higher, but even if you know that that's going to be the case, you do need to fill out this row in your documentation, right? You need to have that calculation done. So we need to take the total monthly income, which is 20,000, and we need to divide that by 12 to get the monthly, or the total annual income, divide that by 12 to get the monthly, and then divide that by 10%, right? And that's going to get you a $16, $17. This is clearly higher. It's usually going to be higher. But one of the things that we often see is folks then skipping this step because we just assume. And if a HUD monitor comes and wants to look at your documentation and thinks that this part is really, really important, that could cause slight problems. So it's always better to have that documentation complete. Okay, so we now know the amount per month of the person's rent. The next thing we need to calculate, or would need to calculate, is a utility allowance. But in order to calculate that utility allowance, we need a little more information than we have in this hypothetical. But I do just want to call out that you do need to always check the utility allowance piece. And what you're looking for there is what utilities are not included in the person's rent. And for each utility that is not included in the person's rent, you're going to indicate you're going to include a utility allowance amount. And that's based on, it's not based on the actual amount the person will be paying for the utilities. It is based on a chart that the housing authority has that gives you the utility allowance for, say, electricity for this type of unit. So don't forget the utility allowance that needs to be deducted from the amount of rent. And another, just to put a point on it, if say the monthly rent that the client should be paying is $189, but none of the utilities are included in the rent and the utility allowances are really high. And so the utility allowance actually comes to 220. Oops, utility allowance, right? If we have a utility allowance of $220, but the person should only be paying a maximum of $189, that means that the project is actually has to be paying the participant that utility allowance. There are a couple of options for that, and we're not going to go over the rules for that again. But again, this is a step where we often see the documentation in this calculation lacking because either folks forget to check the utility allowance, or when the utility allowance is over the amount of rent, we just see, well, then they get paid, they're paying zero, right? But what we also need to reflect is how much reimbursement are they going to be getting? All right. Thank you for your patience as we went through that example. We're going to do one more hypothetical, and it's going to be slightly more complicated. There should be another sheet, and this is for the Buchanan. So I'm going to pull up the Buchanans. So the Buchanan household, right? This is a slightly more complicated household in that there are just more people in it. We have several individuals. We have Brandon and we have Betty. What we know about Brandon, he's receiving income from workers' compensation leave due to an injury in his knee. He's also receiving temporary disability payments. And his doctor thinks he's going to be able to return to work in about 2 months. When he is able to work, his work is part-time and he earns about $12,000 a year. And then his wife, Betty, does not have any income indicated, but she does have a diagnosed disability and she does need in-home assistance. When Brandon is working, there is in-home supportive services that comes to provide attendance, and the cost of that care is about $5,000, but up to about $4,000 are reimbursed. So the total cost to the couple is $1,000. And then Betty does actually have some disability income, SSI, that she gets in the amount of about $500 each month. So let's try to tease some of this out here and before we go, instead of going into the actual chart. I wanted to show you how you would need to include everything in a documentation form, but I think we can start pulling out some of this information here. So the first step is for each member of the household, what is the amount of income? So for Brandon, which income would be included for Brandon in this income calculation? And as a reminder, we're looking forward. We're estimating how much income do we think Brandon is going to be making over the next 12 months. So we need to take into account how much income he is currently receiving. Yep, He's receiving those temporary disability payments. And we also need to take into account exactly the part-time work that he's going to have. Right? So if he returns to work in about 2 months, he's going to be getting this $75 a week for another 2 months. And then for the rest of the year, he's going to be earning at this rate, which is about $1,000 a month. Does anybody want to take a stab at that calculation? What is the expected 12 months of income we're going to see from Brandon? Yeah, I think, Peter, it's a great question. I think it can be more, so Peter's question is for this weekly, because we have income in different periods. We have an annual income and we also have a weekly income. So the question is technically, do you turn this weekly income and estimate how much it would be over the course of the year and then bring it back to monthly? Because we think 2 months. I think it's actually a little more practical than that. I think it's literally in the next, because it's a real time period. It's not generally 2 months of any year. It is the next 2 months. So I think you would want to figure out how many weekly payments that Brandon would be getting in real life before he's expected to go back to work. And so for the sake of this hypothetical, let's just say that this 2 months means 8 weeks of the disability payments. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. Great point, Peter. So a month can be any period, but we would want to be looking at specifically in this whatever case, yeah, whatever case we're looking at, we're actually trying to estimate the real like expected income over the next month. And in this case, we have real concrete information. So we expect 8 weekly payments of $75 each, and then probably 10 months total of part-time work. So who can give us what you think the income we should estimate for Brandon? Hey, very good. Yeah, that's exactly it. So we did 8 times 75, and then we added 10 months of work, right? So this is 8 weeks of disability plus 10 months of part-time work at $1,000 a month. Oops. And that income is going to be included in our calculation. Is there other income that should be included in this calculation? Yeah, great question. All right, so do we include SSI benefits in rent calculation? And we are going to find an answer to that question. This is a resource that we'll make sure that y'all get. It's a sort of a cheat sheet on what to include and what not to include. I'm gonna make it bigger. We're looking for any indication about SSI payments. So it's not going to be under wages and salaries. And just to note, this is what to include and what to exclude. And so each description of a category of income is going to mark include or exclude. It's not wages and salaries. Right? It's not periodic payment. It's not like a regular other type of payment. It is public assistance, including welfare, including SSI. Okay, so welfare assistance, temporary to needy families, SSI, or general assistance are included. So we do include the SSI, right? This is, this is a pretty useful tool for folks who, if you run across a type of income that you're not familiar with, or you're just getting started doing this type of calculation, it can be really helpful to have as a reference. Oh, awesome. Thanks, Nicole. This resource was hyperlinked. So you should have access to it through the bridge module. Nicole, am I screen sharing the right thing?
We're back to the
Yeah, great.
household.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So we are going to include Betty's income, and that is that 500 a month, 12 months equals 6,000, right? So the total income is 16,600, right? So just an example of, if it's a little bit more calculated, if you have complicated, if you have multiple people in the household, you have to make sure to include both, and you need to pay attention to what is the source of income. Okay, let's go to the exclusions, right, and adjustments. We have a couple of pieces of information. We know that Brandon has an injury to his knee, but that's not likely a disability in the way that HUD means it, because he is expecting to return to month. But Betty does have a cerebral palsy diagnosis, and she does need that assistance, right? So when we're thinking about the adjustments, we actually have at least one that's going to come into play. It's the one that we talked about the last one, which is the what's it called? Disabled assistance allowance, right? So they do, because this is an expense for attendant care related to a disability, and it allows Brandon to go to work. We have this total cost of 5,000. We know we subtract the reimbursement, which is 4,000. So it's an attendant care cost of 1,000 a month. And what does that mean for what does that mean for the how much do we adjust the income? If it's 1,000 a month, we take the income, and how much do we remove? We want to subtract the total expected unreimbursed expenses for the rest of the year. At $1,000 a month. So an assumption might be, well, it's $1,000 a month. There are 12 months in a year. Is it going to be $12,000? Except we want to look at actual anticipated or projected expenses. And one of the pieces we have here was that when Brandon was working, they had in-home support services who came to provide this assistance, right? This to me suggests that since Brandon is not currently working, they may not have that in-home assistance coming in, right? It's definitely something that if this was a real situation, you'd have more information, you'd know for sure. Maybe that in-home supportive services didn't pause while Brandon was out, was home. But this indicates to me that potentially it did, right? And so if there's no in-home supportive services expenses while Brandon is not working, in that situation, how much would we want to deduct as an allowance? I think for simplicity's sake, we can say we just ignore the 2 months that Brandon's going to be home, and we estimate $10,000 of unreimbursed expenses. Right? And that's an assumption, right? And we need to know, you wouldn't be making an assumption if you're doing this in practice. You would be figuring out, okay, in reality over the next 12 months, what are those expenses going to be? But that's, a place where you have to pay attention to what that reality is expected to be as best as you can. This is all estimates and projections, right? So based on the information we have a total adjusted income of $6,600. And then last question in the hypo, because we've done our first step, which is figuring out the total amount of income. We've done our second step, which is allowances, right? And our last step is figuring out how much is the participant portion of rent. And this is going to be either 30% of annual adjusted income, or it's going to be 10% of total annual income. If anybody's really interested in doing more math, I'll give you a second to do that, and then I'll just fill it in. Oh, sorry. That is wrong. This is monthly. Sorry. Didn't switch my phrase. This is monthly adjusted income. What we have here is annual. So adjusted to be monthly, the monthly adjusted income is $5,500. If we go to the first total we got and we do that same monthly conversion, we get $1,383 approximately. And then we've got to do our multiplication. So that's going to be 138. Oops. That's going to be 165, right? So again, most of the time it is going to end up being the amount that is the 30% of adjusted income, but you always need to take these steps. You need to go from the annual to the monthly, and then you need to do your multiplication to get to that total amount. So those demonstrations are obviously, because they're hypotheticals, they are inherently simpler. So I know that going through those can feel like, okay, this is such an obvious multiplication problem. But what we wanted to call out with those examples was you want to pay attention to the specifics of each allowance, right? And there are several allowances that have similar sort of topic, like areas, right, that are related to disability or healthcare, and they get at those things in slightly different ways, right? So there is I'm gonna get this screen share up. We have the disability assistance allowance, right? This is one option, but it's specifically for folks who do have a disability, but it's for attendant care or an apparatus, right? Another allowance is the medical expenses allowance, which is general unreimbursed medical expenses specifically for people who are 62 years of age or older or have a disability. And then we have the elderly or disabled household allowance. And actually, this is something we should have caught for the last household as well. They would have had the $400 disability allowance as well, which I didn't catch, because the spouse or head of household, whichever Betty is, had a disability. But this is just a straight, it's not related to expenses. It's just if someone who's the head of household or their spouse is at least 62 or has a disability, then they get this straight $400. Right? And the other thing I wanted to go over with the hypotheticals was that, okay, what do you do if you have a source of income and you don't know whether it should be included in the total income or not? Because some sources of income, you want to note them. You want to understand all of the sources of income that a client is coming in with, and you want to write them all down, but only some of them get included in this calculation. And so, being able to ask those questions, to have that question mark come up, I don't know about SSI, and then you need to go and check, and we have resources for that. Okay. And the last thing I'll say before checking in with y'all to see if you have any questions is this rent calculation is, again, one of the multi-step things. It can become very routine, and that can be very good, right? Because it's a lengthy thing. It can be a lot of piecing together, right? What are the sources of income? How do they relate to each other? Getting all of that information from the participants you're serving, and then having to fill out this form, which can be very tedious. So ideally, I think the calculation part and the math does become routine, but because there are so many details involved and there's so much to take to consider, if you're doing this as part of your job, if you end up doing it as part of your job and you find it becoming routine, that's when I also would recommend you check back in regularly with the rules, right? Maybe, try to get back into Bridge and see if you can do a refresher of the course or whatever it is you think you need to make sure you're not missing stuff when those weird edge cases come up. Any questions about calculating participant rent? Our most favoritist exciting topic? Yeah, we can definitely email all of the materials from today's session. And I just showed you a couple slides that we use when we do our full training presentation live. All the information on those slides was in the Bridge module, but we can also send them to you as slides. Yeah. And we'll send the hypothetical stuff as well, just in case that's interesting to you. Any other questions? I know that not a lot of you actually do this probably in your day-to-day, but does anybody have like a tough case, a tough thing that they've been trying to figure out? Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and I couldn't unmute. Hi everyone, I'm Katie. I work at Abode Services. So yeah, I mean, the only thing I do see is like for a couple programs that I work with, that they're starting to take the 30% of their income to make sure that they're, I guess, still eligible, right? They have to make sure that they're calculating their income correctly, making sure that, like how you were going over, like which income to include, to make sure that they're, getting that correct amount, that 30%.
yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things that you see being like a challenge or something that people maybe
Yeah,
overlook
like
or
it was like a change actually. Like they weren't. I think it was a change in the system, so they
Got it.
started doing that where they said, okay, you know what, we're going to start. It has to be 30% of their income. If they made more than
Mhm.
that, then, or if they made more, then I think they wouldn't. Either would not. I don't think they would qualify then, right?
If it's a COC funded project, there's no income limit for a COC
Oh,
funded
right.
project. Yeah. Yeah.
But
But
maybe the client, participant would probably pay more rent, probably. Like their percentage would go up. Like they would have to
yeah.
pay more.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I think brings up another point that's good to come back to because related to that, which is how often do you do this, right? And it does need to be done, we think at least annually. HUD says regularly,
Right.
annually is good. And so, yeah, if someone's income has gone up, they're going to pay more rent for, or if their projected income for the next year, when you're doing this again, is going to be higher, then the amount of rent they pay will go up for sure.
Right. For like the recertification, right? So annually,
Yeah.
like you're saying, like every year. And then I know that during the year, if there is any income change, they do have to submit that. Like they're supposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those mid-year, like between the recertifications, what we've actually seen the HUD guidance suggest or say is if someone's income, if you're checking in with them about their income as a project, you should know when they change, when their income changes, even if it's a
That's
really
true.
small change, right? Because you want
That's
to put it in HMIS for data quality. But if their income goes down, HUD's recommendation is you should always do or like recalculate their income. And that's our recommendation too, because then the portion of their rent goes down and that's, that's good because their income has reduced. If someone's income goes up in between income recertifications, you don't necessarily have to recalculate. It's not going to be a compliance issue
Okay.
if you wait until the next annual recertification. I think if someone's income goes up considerably, significantly,
Right.
might
Then
be
that would
something
be
you want to
different.
do, but
Okay. Thank you, Ellie.
yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. And as always, we're here if you do have questions about any of the COC compliance stuff or any bridge bridge questions or bridge access issues for our learning management system. Thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
And Manuel, if you're still here, I just want to clarify because I did see the email. This is the live training. So you're here. The leasing versus rental assistance one, that's just the module that's on Bridge. So this is the live training for this program.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.